All right, so we're going to go forward into evolution, and what you're going to realize is that this section, it really harbors around your understanding of a lot of vocabulary terms, so that's what I have to spend a lot of time on, giving you examples when I can, and that usually gets you through any information, because the questions that you usually get give you enough information to answer it, but in order to get to that point, you have to know if they use the words, you have to kind of know they don't give you the definition in the actual question. So I'll go through. It kind of spans a lot of different topics, these videos, unfortunately, because they just jump from one topic of vocabulary to another. But going with the flow of the textbook that I used to create this, the next section kind of talks about, now, how old is Earth? They just finished with half-life and determining the age of things using radioactive elements and isotopes. So now the next question is, well, let's figure out how old this Earth is. And what they've done is they created a time scale. So the way that you read this is going to be your present day. Everything is about how many millions of years ago things happened. So right now we would say that this is our current time frame. Things further away from the top of this scale would be longer in our history. So they give you roundabout ages. They are in millions of years ago. So it goes all the way back. There's a lot of breakdown, but we're going all the way back to the beginning, which they roughly estimate to be about 4,600 million years ago, which is roughly 4.6 billion years ago. And the things that you should know, if I knew anything was recognizing the terms, there's no way that you would have to recognize and memorize periods, but realize that periods are broken down from eras. So if you're thinking about just getting more specific, your periods are going to be your smallest time frame. Eras are probably the most used term, so maybe you recognize the order of these. And going back, this is not to scale. If you notice that the Precambrian, this is, on this version, they're calling it Pre-Cambrian Time. In other textbooks, I have seen it been referred to as the Precambrian Era. So this is the longest span of time. So if you notice that the period of the Cambrian, that started 542 million years ago versus the beginning of the Precambrian. So this purple frame of color, that's 4.6 billion to 542 million. So that's a large span. That is, again, almost 4,000 million years or 4 billion years where really not much was going on. That's because this was the beginning of Earth. We'll talk about that. And there were things that had to arise. You just weren't forming an Earth and then thinking that things were just going to be formed and living beings and large complex organisms. That takes time to go through. So we have the Precambrian era, the Paleozoic era, and the Mesozoic era, and we are currently in the Cenozoic era. You might recognize some of these things like Jurassic as a period. Now you're seeing like, okay, these all come from whatever the organism that maybe arose during that time. And they use a lot of Latin terms. So if you're not really familiar with Latin vocabulary, you probably don't recognize these, as I am not too familiar with every single one of these. But I know like Devonian is bird. That's the bird area. So in the previous, there's an activity that you do where we kind of draw this to scale. This is not to scale because it doesn't really give you that perspective. But if you draw this to scale, humans literally were developed right. If we did this to scale, it would probably be right on that line that we are currently in. Like, we are a blip on the radar of how long this Earth has been around. And it usually comes to shock when people realize, when they do it to scale, where like 1 million years represents a millimeter, how far away the beginning of human life began is so close to present day. It's pretty shocking. So that's a geologic timescale. I've seen questions where they give you this, not asking you to memorize it, and just interpret it. The big thing is making sure that you recognize what is the years ago this would be. So if I said, what period ended 299 million years ago, you got to start thinking, okay, well, which one of these is the end date? All right. So the one that was closer to time, present day, which is the lower number, is the end date. So that would probably be, people would get this wrong if I said the end of a period. And so 299 ends that period, even though that kind of seems counterintuitive for you to think that a lower number is the end. So just recognize that. That would be my suggestion. So from there, what makes them change different periods and eras actually comes down to a lot of extinctions. So there are many extinctions that have happened in our planet's lifespan. And what usually happens at the spike of an extinction, that means a lot of other forms of life might now be able to predominate. So that it kind of changes the landscape of the Earth. And that's when they change the naming of periods and what might now be the predominant organism. So you kind of can see this. They have some big ones. If it's a huge extinction, that's usually the sign that you're going to change into a different era, but they do it within different periods as well. You have not lived within multiple periods, nor do I think that you ever hopefully will. If you live within a different period, that probably means that you ended. Human extinction is probably going to be, if they would continue to be able to track that, that would probably be the end of a extinction of, that would be a period end, and definitely other organisms would hopefully survive. So how quickly does this happen? There are two theories. Punctuated equilibrium, which is designated on this picture on the left, and then gradualism over here on the right. You know, definition of evolution hopefully is a slow process. That's usually a slow, steady process. That's gradualism. That's the idea of gradualism, is evolution is a slow, steady process where things change over time. But what starts to happen is there is this idea of punctuated equilibrium that kind of says, I don't know if you can really see that. I'm not sure how the best way to kind of talk about this in the coordination, but punctuated equilibrium states that there are time frames where there's not much change, and then there's rapid change. So here you can kind of see, I guess they're doing these intermediate colors here to showcase that they're gradually changing. But here you are changing from, you have a blue and a pink. You don't really have a hybrid of that. Punctuated equilibrium is periods of little change and then all of a sudden a rapid change. And that might be because of mass extinctions, because of climate change and things like that. But there are two theories of how rates of evolution occur. So there you have those two. Now, patterns of macroevolution. These, again, vocabulary, so making sure we recognize and maybe some examples. Here's a graphic to show what is called adaptive radiation, and I would probably say some textbooks will refer to this as divergent evolution. There is an ancestor. A lot of people misrepresent the way that evolution happens, and they might say, oh, we evolved from primates or we evolved from chimpanzees. That is not the case. What adaptive radiation states is that there was a common ancestor that is not around today. There was a common ancestor, which might have been an ancestor of the primates, of chimpanzees, of us. And we have diverged in different pathways to become who we are today. So it's not that you look at this diagram and say that this organism evolved into this organism, which evolved into this organism. That is not the case. What we're saying is there was a split, and these groups of organisms split at a much sooner or further back in history of time than these organisms did. So it's kind of a way to recognize who's closest together. So you would probably put these two organisms closer together on their evolutionary ties than you would with, this organism and this organism. Okay. So it's just a way to say that organisms are constantly changing and that ancestors may split. We're going to get into Darwin in a little bit more detail, but Darwin's idea is that he recognized adaptive radiation with his birds, where there was a common ancestor that must have happened, and these 13 species of birds all flew to different islands, and they were separated long enough that they started to change. And so they had a common ancestor, but since they have all separated for a long enough period of time, they now have radiated from that, if you want. I don't know why they use these terms, adaptive radiation, but it's along the same lines of divergent evolution. Which, the flip side, there is an idea of convergent evolution. And convergent evolution does not mean organisms that are different are now going to become one and they can start mating with each other. That is not how evolution works either. But what they're showcasing in this diagram is they're saying, look at these organisms. Okay? They may look alike, but they are not ancestors of each other. It's not that one ancestor actually split to make these. What they're saying is that these organisms have evolved because of the environment that they're placed in. The body frame that they have has kind of said this is what is good to survive here. So it doesn't mean that they are converging. And so an aardvark and an armadillo are not ever going to be able to go out on a date and eventually make ardadillos. If that's not, convergent evolution is where organisms within a similar environment may start to, these organisms that survive have a same idea. So like in the water, streamline effect, fish with whales and dolphins, they all have a similar look. That doesn't mean that whales and sharks are going to mate, but that streamline is beneficial for swimming. They're not going to be box-like and think that they're going to be a good swimmer and survive in the ocean. So that's convergent evolution. Coevolution, this is when two organisms, back to this font, I'm going to try and change the font here. Of course, my sorry, the program that I'm recording literally has itself right over the font option, so I'm trying to find other ways to change the... Okay, this is the only way. Sorry about that. I'm sure it's going to revert back. That's exactly what it did. Okay, so coevolution. The idea that co means you're kind of going with something else like coworkers, colleagues, co. One organism evolves in response to another, or two organisms evolve together. And this is very indicative of predator and prey. So if you think of any common predator-prey relationship out there, if you're doing like a lion and a gazelle, if a gazelle gets faster, the lion better get faster or the gazelle's always going to get away. So it's kind of this idea that things have to go together. If one gets stronger, the other better get stronger as well. There are some really interesting scenarios out there that have examples that I can't get to into a short video, but if you're given an example and you see that these two organisms that rely on each other are evolving similarly to kind of keep up with each other, then you're probably dealing with some type of coevolution. Okay? And then this kind of goes hand in hand with the origin, that spectrum, or the geologic timeline that we just went through. Earth's history, the idea that this happened, Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago after it had the capability, the Big Bang Theory. So this is getting into some of your Earth space history, but realizing that the early atmosphere of Earth was very much different than current atmosphere. So there wasn't that oxygen. There was nothing as much. There was no oxygen. Sorry, there was right side. You're dealing with no oxygen. There was no organism that could produce oxygen. So look at nitrogen is taking up the majority. Very little back then. Water vapor was your primary. So you can kind of see there was a big, big change. And the Earth's age, as I kind of mentioned, was 4.6 billion years ago. And we're going to discuss in a future video, there are some experiments using these early atmosphere gases. It's called the heterotroph hypothesis, trying to figure out how did we go from a newborn Earth to actually living things. You have to kind of put the parts together. You're just not going to have a living cell right on day one. You got to start building it very, very slowly. So we are going to go through the different types of how these organisms came to be. You got to have organic compounds first. So this, I'm running out of time right now, so I'll pick this up in the next video, but we're going to start talking about where the parts for life came to be and who discovered these.